going to talk about a project called Jupyter. So my name is Matt Burton, and actually let me refresh this. There we go. My name is Matt Burton, and you can hit me on Twitter at mcburton. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. And so I'm going to talk to you today about something that is going to look really funky because this was actually designed to be slides, but the slide system is not working. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through it. But it actually looks a lot similar to what you were just looking at with the R Markdown rendered HTML. So it actually, there's some nice synergies here. So I'm going to talk about Project Jupyter, which how many people here have kind of done anything with Python programming before? Okay, so a few people. And how many of you have heard of IPython? All right, excellent. And so then how many of those of you who have actually heard of Project Jupyter before? So some similar people, yep. Okay, so Project Jupyter is kind of it's a tool, but it's also a whole larger set of infrastructure around doing interactive computing and interactive data science. That is now computationally, it's programming language agnostic. So the idea is to, it originally was a Python programming notebook, a laboratory notebook for doing Python programming, but it has now been kind of generalized to support lots of different Python programming languages. And so, that's where the name, it used to be called IPython, and now it has actually evolved into Jupyter, which is actually, the name comes from the concatenation of Julia, Python, and R, which are kind of the three main languages that it targets. But it actually works, and I'll talk a little bit later about it actually can support any programming language that's possible. And so, basically, the idea is they're creating a platform for interactive computing that supports open science, but it's also more than just open science. So actually, my background is in digital humanities, which is a fellow traveler in this to the open science world, but kind of maybe we have slightly different data and some slightly different methods, but we do some of the same things. And actually, a lot of people in the digital humanities community use Jupyter notebooks as well. So, and since we're on crunch for time, I'm going to be moving kind of quickly, but the way that Jupyter works and the way that it can support all these different things is it has kind of three different components. So the first component is on this little orange blob is the computational kernel. So this is the piece that actually executes code, and the kernel can be done in any programming language that you want. So if you really like R, you can use R. If you like Python, you can use Python. And if there's like a bit of some turf battles that happen between those two communities. Some people like R, some people like Python. I like both. They're good at different things. There's a new kid on the block called Julia, which you might start to see popping up. It's kind of like the marriage of the two. Some of the things that you can do in Python and some of the things you could do in Julia are combined together, or in Python and R. And so, yeah, I'm not sure actually where the name Julia came from. I wish I knew. There's probably a funny story there, or I'm assuming. So there's the kernel component to it. And then, in the next piece, the gray blob in the middle, and these are my beautiful artistic renderings of the components of Jupyter, is the notebook server. And so what happens is there's a separate component that is a web application, so that if you want to compose and author these notebooks, you run the notebook server, and it runs it in a web browser. So all of your analytical work and all the code that you would write and all the text that you would write, you can do it inside of a web browser, which means that it could run on your local laptop, kind of like in the way that we were seeing with OpenRefine and RStudio, but it can also run in the cloud for instance, one of the things I'm doing right now is trying to get Jupyter running on a supercomputer. So if you have a lot of data and it's too big for your laptop, you can run the Jupyter infrastructure up in the cloud and just log into it remotely with the web browser and be able to compose your notebooks and do all that work. The final piece with Jupyter, and the part that I'm going to kind of focus on a little bit more today, is the green blob all the way on the right, and that's the notebook format. And the notebook format is kind of the really interesting component about the presentation and the shareability and the reproducibility of this, is it allows you to encapsulate all the code work that you did and basically store some of the provenance of that research workflow into a file format that can be shared around. So each notebook, when you're doing the work, each notebook is assigned to a specific kernel. So every notebook is only one programming language, although you can actually mix languages inside of the notebook a little bit. But that machinery is works to some degree, works better than others. But here are some of the example languages. There's Python, R. You can also do Ruby or Haskell. Scala is another one. But any programming language, there's been some talk about possibly even making a COBOL kernel. So if you really want to do COBOL programming in the Jupyter notebook, I can't remember if it may not work, but it could happen. Fortran, I think there is a Fortran kernel if you're doing some old school scientific computing. There's still a lot of stuff that's implemented in Fortran. So the notebook server, this is actually an example of what it looks like. So this is the web application. So the notebook server is the web application. It lets you browse with a dashboard that lets you kind of look at file systems, and if you're looking at a remote file system, you can load up your notebooks and manage your files and manage data files and also text files, and you can create new notebooks, and you can even actually run a terminal command line. So if you are familiar with using the command line, you can actually run the command line through the Jupyter Notebook server. And so that kind of gives the ability to swap back and forth and do some administrative things, as well as running your computational work inside the notebook. And so this is actually the real big piece here, the major, a lot of development is going into this, is the notebook application is the system for editing the Jupyter Notebook. And this, if we were just looking at RStudio, and RStudio has that interactive console where you can run and execute code, but there was also the separate piece where you were writing the R Markdown and writing the kind of the text. What Jupyter does is it merges all of that together into one kind of format. And so what you end up happening is you end up kind of writing, and so all these are actually, none of this is code. This is all Markdown, or basically text. This is actually the notebook that I'm presenting. This is a screenshot. Talk about like Inception. This is a screenshot of me editing this exact notebook that I'm presenting to you right now. That's being rendered as HTML. So there's kind of many layers here, and that's one of the neat things you can do. And you can actually I've been actually doing lots of presentations, and not even using the kind of the code components of it, but just using it's a really great platform for just making HTML documents and authoring stuff in HTML and then transforming that into an HTML web page or throwing it up on GitHub to be presented like what I'm doing right now. But let me explain what we're looking at here by diving into the actual anatomy of the notebook. So the way the notebook works, and the way the kind of the execution is broken up is notebooks are composed of cells. So if you've used Mathematica or MATLAB, there's a little bit, that design is actually where the idea of cells and executable cells come from. And so there's different types of cells inside the notebook that let you do kind of expressive or computational work, depending on how you want to compose your notebook. So the most fun, or the funnest cells, are the code cells. And so this is where you would put your Python or your R code. You'd put snippets of it, and you can basically execute an individual cell, and then if that code has output, it'll spit the output down right below it. So we have here, this is a code cell that all it really does is print hello world. It's very basic and very simple, and then hello world gets spit out right beneath it. And so it's very similar to what we were just looking at with the R Markdown. And so you can kind of build up all of these, and what's happening in the background is the notebook server, when you say execute this cell, it takes that piece of code, it sends it to the kernel that is running behind this notebook, that's kind of all put together, pieced together, and plumbed with the Jupyter Notebook architecture, and it then executes that piece of code in the kernel. And so when there's a kernel running, all of the work that you've done is saved and is active and available to you in that kernel, and each kernel maps to a single notebook. I'll talk a little bit about why the kernel architecture is actually really crucially important for this kind of very expanded notion of presentation of data and reproducibility in a little bit. But the other kind of major cell that people use when they're authoring and composing Jupyter notebooks are the Markdown cells. So these are also pretty fun. And this is kind of what, all of the HTML that you're seeing right now is I composed using these Markdown cells. And basically, it's a way of writing HTML without having to write all the angle brackets, because angle brackets are not super pretty. And so you just do things like hash marks and dashes to represent things like lists and heading files. And it's basically a way of writing semantically rich text, but using plain text, so you're not having necessarily to write all the tags. And so this little snippet of Markdown, when you execute that cell, it renders it immediately as HTML, and it looks like this. And you can do links and headers and all that sort of stuff, and all the stuff that you're actually seeing right now. The final kind of main cell that we talk about is the raw text cell. So this is like kind of the not quite as fun. There's some text, and if you execute it, it doesn't do anything. It just spits out plain text, and that is available for if one of the things is if you want to do something like R, for instance. A lot of times it outputs it spits out plain text that's got spacing and uses spacing to kind of manage its formatting. And if you want to copy and paste that and present that, you would use this plain text cell to represent that spacing, because Markdown will really screw up your plain text if you're just trying to when you render it as HTML. But so what's really interesting is that these are the three basic components of a Jupyter notebook, but you can then mix those together to create these really rich modes of output. So a slightly more advanced example here, and this is not actually running live because I'm visualizing this as a static representation, but I'll show you a live version if we have a little bit of time. You can do kind of like what we were just looking at. You can write your code up here, and this is the code to do. So the most popular plotting library in Python is called Matplotlib. It's a little wonkier and uglier than ggplot, but there is a ggplot for Python, but I have not actually used it. But this is just a quick example where you're generating a sine generating a sine curve and plotting it. And what's neat is it just, you could edit your code up here and then just execute the cell again, and it'll redraw the plot right there in line with the code. And so I've used this very extensively when I'm kind of tweaking, when I need to publish an image or a plot or a graph of my data. I'll kind of tweak it, tweak the data, make sure the data's okay, and then I'll tweak the graph and get the formatting all correct. And I can just keep running it, and it really cuts down that time because it's right there in front of you. You don't have to like save a file and then open it up. It's just right there in front of you. So you can very quickly do these feedback loops to debug and to just get everything the way you really like it. And then you can then export this as a file to embed into a traditional journal article, or you could not and actually compose the whole narrative inside the context of the notebook. Because what's really neat about this is you can have the code cell and you can have a Markdown cell right next to it, and you can kind of write your narrative and write the text that would accompany this plot alongside the plot, and then use the notebook as the actual format that you would save and share this with and quote, publish it. And I'll show an example of that in a second. Another neat one, just kind of the rich display. So Python or R or the programming languages can, instead of outputting plain text, which is kind of the main mode that R uses, somebody has, the pandas, which is kind of a library for Python that is kind of gives you R-like data frames and lets you do R-like work in Python. What they've done is like if this syntax will look kind of similar, right? We're basically selecting just some of the first rows. But when we output the data, instead of spitting out text, it'll actually it knows that it's running inside of a notebook, and so instead of spitting back text, it spits back HTML. And so what it does is then the notebook can then, because the notebook is running in a browser, anything that a browser can render and visualize, you can render and visualize inside of a notebook. And so this is just what it does is it's taking that data from the data frame and rendering it as an HTML table. And so you can, and what this data is, this is some really fun data that I downloaded from the Carnegie Museum of Art. They've put all of the metadata for their art collection online in a CSV file that's up on GitHub, and so you can just download it and open it. So this is a selection of that data, and you can, unfortunately, you can't scroll, but there's tons of columns in this. So this is all the data from Carnegie Museum of Art, and we can just very quickly take a look at see what's in there. So under the hood, all of this is saved and serialized as a JSON document, as a JSON format. So all of the code, all of the markdown, and also the output. So the figures themselves get saved inside of the context of this JSON document. And so this is a standard format. They have a schema for it, and they're kind of, I think they're at version 4, but they're starting to think about, what would it mean to like submit this as a journal article? If everyone kind of starts using this JSON, this document format as the underlying format, instead of submitting Microsoft Word or LaTeX, you could maybe use this. And so what's really nice about this is you can basically then, all these components fit together to basically make what Fernando Perez, who is the creator of the project and the creator of IPython and now one of the lead people on the Jupyter project, he calls them computational narratives. And so one of the ways to think about this is computational narratives are these narratives that blend text and code and data together, or in my terrible artistic rendering, it's more like Klingon dots and a dinosaur. I'm not the greatest artist, but I have no shame in presenting you with my terrible art. But the neat thing is that you can bring all this stuff together, and because you have the notebook as a container format, it gives you a much more powerful mode of expression. So you can, as a single document that either can be saved as a static HTML file, but it could also be served up live, and other people could then access the live running executing notebook and tweak it and save it. And there's all this, I'll talk about it in a second, there's all this work that lets you to view other people's notebooks and manipulate them. You can compose these really interesting narratives that are more than just text or more than just figures and more than just plain text. They're more living. And so this is what's really powerful and neat. And they enable, one of the things that's happening right now is the Jupyter Notebook project is working really hard. They just got a big grant to allow for the collaborative authoring of these notebooks in the environment. So if you've ever used Google Docs and you've edited Google Docs live and had 2 or 3 people writing at the same time, so imagine doing that, but not just with text, but with actual code and with data analysis. And the possibilities here are very exciting. So they are working on that right now. And we'll see what comes out from it. They just got a big grant from the Moore Foundation and the Sloan Foundation to work on this component of it. But the other neat piece about this is just how shareable it becomes. GitHub, you can just post it up on GitHub, and then other people can download the notebooks and run them themselves, or they could run them in the cloud. And it just becomes a platform and a mechanism for which you can kind of present and share and perform and do open science or open scholarship, which is the way I like to say it, because I engage with communities outside of the scientific communities. And what's really neat is they are becoming publishable. So O'Reilly Media is starting to work with Jupyter Notebooks. So if you're writing a technology book in O'Reilly, you can actually submit Jupyter Notebooks, and they will help with the transformation of that into their standard publishing workflows. I have a link here, but I won't click it because the internet's working really slowly and I'm running out of time. But one of the things that's neat is journalists have really taken to the Jupyter Notebooks like cats to catnip. And actually, one of the journalists quote, although I think they are really doing some great work, is BuzzFeed. And so what BuzzFeed does is if they're doing a data journalist article, they will publish the article in a kind of on BuzzFeed, with text and pictures, and they can get all their click, eyeballs and get all that stuff. But they'll link back to GitHub And there are Jupyter notebooks, and all the Jupyter notebooks that they used to perform the analysis and all the data that they did and used to kind of write that, that article is available on GitHub. And it basically links back to the computational narrative that helped them create the more traditional narrative that they use to kind of explicate their results. And so they actually have one. This is a link here, and all this is on GitHub, but there's a link here to some stuff they did on minimum wage and tuition. So there's this amazing ecosystem around Jupyter that enables you to do all, and this is really brand new, some of this stuff, and so it's moving very quickly. But one of the big ones is NBD Viewer, which is a very simple way if you have posted your Jupyter notebook on the web and it's accessible, and you can render it as HTML or even as slides, which is what I tried to do, but NBD Viewer wasn't quite working today. And so you can, and people are like publishing books. There's a couple books here, Python signal processing and probabilistic programming, and they're you can read them in NBD Viewer and then you can actually download the notebooks and run them on your own machine. So one thing that NBD Viewer doesn't let you do is run the code. And so similarly, GitHub is also, if you upload a Jupyter notebook to GitHub, it will render it, and we're actually looking at it right now, but it'll render the notebook as static HTML in GitHub, in the standard GitHub interface. And this is really cool. GitHub is actually very excited about working on, and they are definitely trying to help the Jupyter ecosystem. And one of the big things that kind of connects back to Chris's talk is all of these things, RStudio, Jupyter, all these things in GitHub and Zenodo, all these things kind of connect together. So you could upload your Jupyter notebook to GitHub, and then you could share it, and people can look at it, and they can download it or fork it if they wanted to. And then you could also push it and connect it up to Zenodo, because you can use the Zenodo integration. So you can get DOIs for your Jupyter notebooks, which is what some people are actually already starting to do. But there's a couple ways, those are all static. There are ways now, the newest thing is using what's called live notebooks and being able to edit and manipulate the code in the browser on somebody else's, you being able to download or access their workflow that they composed in their computational narrative in the notebook. And so there's a project here called Binder, which is out of a group that what they've done is basically, if you have a GitHub repository, you can point it, and this infrastructure will automatically download the notebooks and load up an environment so that you can execute that code in the cloud and manipulate it and work with it. And it's basically, if you have a reproducible notebook, the idea here is like, don't just link to a static version, link to the binder, the live binder version, and you can, it'll spin it up in a temporary environment, and you can begin to interact with the code that they used. And so this is a brand new project. It's super exciting. The team is moving at like 1,000 miles an hour, and so we'll probably begin to see some of the ideas that here integrated back into the Jupyter ecosystem itself. But you can do really neat things. You can't really see it here, but you can even do stuff like Python, like Spark, and use some pretty heavy-duty data science tools just off in the cloud. And all you got to do is, there's a couple things you have to do about configuration, but it just works. I actually taught a workshop where I had all this, instead of like configuring and having the students install Jupyter and Python on their own machines, I just sent them a link to this, and they each got their own environment automatically spun up and running. I think this all runs in Google's computing cloud, and they all had their own environment that was just running on the browser. And so it saved us the installation headache, and just let me focus on teaching English students how to make Twitter bots, which was the other thing. So the other one I'll talk about, this builds on top of a service called TNPNB, which is the temporary notebook service. So if you have a notebook and you just want to test it out, or you just want to play with the environment, you can basically, this is a very complicated diagram, but it basically lets you create temporary notebook environments to kind of play with stuff. And I'll actually just show you right now what that looks like. .org. So now magically we are now running like that, that all the ecosystem. Now we have a couple, we're running a live Jupyter notebook server that's a temporary one, and it's not, we're not getting a supercomputer here. This is a very small, very little environment. But if you, I got this. now we are actually running a live, running in a live notebook. So if I just click on execute cell and run it, there it goes. So it basically, I hit the play button, it executed this code, and then rendered the plot right underneath it. And if we change this, let's see, what could I change? I don't know what'll happen if let's do 10,000 and see what happens. This may break because I haven't tested it. I should have probably done that ahead of time, but let's run it. And we get a value error. Well, we can do something. Let's do a slightly innocuous change by saying hello. And we can run it. And you'll see hello is rendered right down there in the plot. So this is the temporary notebook service. And so what has now happened is folks have where am I? Here we go. What you can start to do. So one of the things, and one really fun one was somebody kind of recreated these funny, pretty-looking XKCD plots in Matplotlib, and so they included a Jupyter notebook that shows you how to render. It's basically a lot of Matplotlib banging your head against things, but it makes these very pretty and fun-looking graphs. This is I did a Twitter bot workshop, and so this actually is so what you can do and I won't do it now because we don't have time and it's not quite working because you have to have an API key for Twitter. But all the code to make your Twitter bot, you can just you can run it in Binder, and you can run your own Twitter bot just temporarily. It won't run forever, but just temporarily for teaching purposes. I had all the code and all the boilerplate ready to go, already written in a notebook, so the students could just focus on what it is they want their notebook, what they want their Twitter bot to say. Another one that's really cool, and I really want to show you. There's two left, and I know I'm a little over time. This one I want to tell you about is you can do animated. One, you can do animated GIFs or GIFs, depending on. I think I can't remember what my allegiance is to GIFs or GIFs these days. But a student at the University of Pittsburgh. There's a big thing about bikers right now, and a woman was unfortunately killed right on the street a couple weeks ago, and it's really a sad situation. And so one of the things that that he wanted to know, well, how fast are the cars moving on this street? And so he wrote a Julia notebook. This is actually it's written in the notebook format, but he put together a whole kind of narrative about kind of using his webcam. So using his phone, he recorded a video of cars, and then he wrote this whole narrative around analyzing that video in order to determine how fast were those cars moving. And so he was able to kind of stitch all this stuff together, and he used some machine learning libraries that are available in Julia, and was able to, and included some text about explaining what he was doing. And then here's the actual code that does the analysis. There's more code. Here's all the code, but then here's you can begin to kind of play with the output. And then here's some kind of interpretation of what came out of it. And then some more text, and you can see there's this iterative workflow of kind of playing with something, analyzing some data, getting an output, reanalyzing it, remunging it. And so he was able to, he talks about how he actually did detected that the cars were cars and distinguished them from the road, and this is all computer vision analysis. And it's all, it's a pretty substantive, notebook and narrative. I mean, this is, and it's beautiful. And so he was finally, it's all the code that went into the production of that one animated GIF that goes right here. That if you can't really see it, but there's those little each car has a box around it that labels the speed that the car is traveling at. And so another extension to this is Nature actually wrote an article about Jupyter notebooks, and one of the things they included was a live link in the article that connected back to the notebook that was that basically shows the promise of reproducible science. So imagine a Nature article getting published, and you could, let's see if I click here, you can view the interactive demo, and what happens is this runs launches basically another interactive notebook, running that, I think it's running on Rackspace, and it basically connects you back to the analysis of the science, and we can actually edit this. Let's see what happens when we run this. Oop. And there we go. So this is now, it's very hard to see because they embedded it. It's, we're getting kind of squished, but, so this is now running in Nature. This is all running on Nature's infrastructure, and they preloaded it with the notebook that came with that article, and now we can actually play with the data and perform our own analysis or test the assumptions or test hypotheses. And so, yeah, this is all like this notion of computational narrative is if there's one thing that I want you to take out of this is like the tool and the infrastructure that Jupyter provides, but also the ecosystem around our notebook and our studio and GitHub and all of this open science work enables a kind of expression and a way of articulating and expressing knowledge that is deeply powerful and open and connected, interconnected to everything, all these pieces. So rather than just looking at a print article, we can really get our fingers and our hands dirty with the data. It's all possible from this tool, or all this whole collection, this whole ecosystem of tools that are coming out of the open science movement. And it's really exciting, and it's going to be, they have like 20 people, full-time developers working on this. So, there's going to be new stuff next year. If I give a presentation, it might be all new, really neat things that you can do with this. Definitely people are going to start asking about it. It's starting to get out there, this notion of Jupyter project, and so it's something to kind of keep, if you're thinking about a tool to keep an eye on, because of this whole, there's all these different tools. This one is really amazing because it's an underlying infrastructure that lets you do a lot of different things. It lets you do Python, it lets you do R, it lets you do rich multimodal expression. It lets you get in with data and visualization. So it's all there. And with that, I will let you go. Sorry to keep you from lunch. All right. I guess if there's any questions. So the question is about which browser to use. I typically use Chrome, but what's really nice about this is they're using open standards to develop the format and the server, so it should work in any browser, as long as you're not using IE6. I'm pretty sure it doesn't work in IE6. All this is made possible by some web technologies, like not to get too wonky, but WebSockets, this ability for, to keep an open channel between the browser and the back end. So, they've been actually trying to build this for years, but I think they went through 4 different iterations before they finally got it working, because the web technology had kind of, basically enables you to make really rich web applications. But I usually use Chrome. But you can do it. I also do it in Safari. I haven't tried it in the new, it's not Internet Explorer. I can't remember what Windows 10, their new browser is, but it should work in any one of them just fine. Question in the back?
It seems like it would take researchers a long way towards what the funding agencies are asking for. They're asking for users for
Mm-hmm.
data included, the data linked. It seems like the notebook would really take the researchers pretty far down that road.
Yeah, so I think it could be, yeah, so the point about that this kind of, in terms of the research requirements for open data and data management plans, and the next big wave is going to be around workflows and open workflows, and this is a generalized infrastructure and a set of formats for expressing computational science workflows. And so I think, I don't want to say it's the only one. For instance, I really like R Markdown is a kind of another orthogonal, but related but slightly different way of expressing computational workflows. There's some other projects that do similar things, but I think from the funders, from the funding agencies, we have these open publishing and open data requirements, data management planning requirements. I think we're going to the next stage is going to be workflows for sure, and this will help greatly in that. So it won't be one of these not unfunded but uninfrastructured mandates. I think we actually do have an infrastructured. The pieces are in place and are being developed, which is really exciting. All right, well, thank you.